Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing? Got some food in you? Ready to go to sleep? Hopefully not. Well, I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today. So just a little bit about myself. 5 years ago, me and a colleague decided to start a new architecture program in the state of Utah, in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States. And with this architecture program, we wanted to do something a little bit different. And we decided we're going to create a classical, traditional, vernacular architecture program. Now, that's coming from someone that was trained as a modernist. And so you might think, what are you doing trying to create something you never were trained to do? So my talk today is going to be a little bit about that process, but also what we've discovered in doing so. So my talk today is Beauty and the Brain, and we're going to reconsider the role of ornament. But before I do that, I want you to look at these two images of buildings. What do you notice in these two images? Perhaps it is that one is very simple, it's very plain, it doesn't have a lot of details on it. The other one has a lot of ornament. Now, I'm going to give you a quote, wrong way. I'm going to share a little quote by Philip Johnson in their 1922 book on the international style. And I want you to think about this as you're looking at these two images. He says, the absence of ornament serves as much as regular horizontality to differentiate superficially the current style from the styles of the past. Now, with this, when I attended architecture school, I was taught that this building on the left, that was good. That was good design. And we were supposed to emulate that. Now, my professor said this image on the right, that was bad architecture. Now, at the time, as I was going through architecture school, my wife would often say, you know, your buildings, when you're designing these, they often feel really cold, sterile, they're not very warm and inviting, but they're rather boring. I said, well, sorry, honey, my professors, they know what they're talking about. They said this is good, and they said this is bad. But then we would go and visit buildings like the one on your right, and she would say, this is beautiful architecture. Your stuff's ugly. So I have since come to the realization I've had to repent and say, sorry, honey, I was wrong. You were right. And so where did all this stem from? Well, Adolf Loos, in his 1908 essay titled Ornament and Crime, argued the following. He said, quote, the modern person who tattoos himself is either a criminal or a degenerate. We have gone beyond ornament. We have achieved plain, undecorated simplicity. Now, he considered ornament to be criminal, primitive, wasteful, and pleasureless. In fact, Le Corbusier praised Loos as one of the predecessors of this new spirit. Around 1900, when the enthusiasm for the Juden style was high in the time of excessive decor, Loos began this crusade against the redundancy of these tendencies, Corbusier argued. Now, like Corbusier, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe advocated for an architecture of simplicity and promoted the phrase, less is more. Now, this ideology continues to be promulgated in schools of architecture, but not all have embraced this. We have Robert Venturi, who says, instead, less is a bore. So who is right of all these thoughts? This is one of the things we're going to explore today as we look at ornament. Should architects adhere to Loos's philosophy that ornament is a crime? Or that Mies's celebrated mantra of less is more, or should they heed Venturi's provocative assertion that less is a bore? So by diving into various related concepts, we're going to explore this topic and understand the significant role that ornament plays and its effect on architectural design, but also human health and well-being. So we're going to begin by asking the question, what is beauty? According to Plato and Aristotle, beauty was this measurable condition. Beauty, as Dr. Burris said earlier this morning, was related to truth and goodness. It is this means to another end. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that it was this union of order. It was also dealt with symmetry, with magnitude and scale, when nothing could be added or taken away from a composition, but it would be detrimental to the whole. Now, we've already seen how the ancient Greeks and Athenian culture counted beauty among the ultimate values of society. We see this expressed architecturally, right, with the Parthenon on the Acropolis. And then if we flash forward 400 years, the Roman architect Vitruvius writes in his treatise on architecture that good architecture is composed of three things, one of which, venustas, delight, beauty, or tied to aesthetics. Now, when Alberti comes into the picture 1,400 years later, he defines beauty as this relationship between the parts and the whole composition. So we ask ourselves in the 21st century, is this still a good definition of beauty? Now, when we look at buildings in and of themselves, and we've already seen some of these images, our brain makes a judgment call within the first 3 to 5 seconds, whether something is interesting to look at or not. In this first glance phase of vision, we can call this that something happens on the unconscious level. Before our age, gender, education comes into play, unconsciously, our brain allows us to choose one or the other. For now, we're going to call this attractiveness the beauty factor. Philosophers have long argued that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but science is now revealing that beauty is actually in the brain of the beholder, especially when visual attention is captured and looked at. Now, according to the neurobiology research by Semir Zeki, fMRI brain scans reveal that when people listen to a beautiful piece of music, or they look at a beautiful image, a singular part of their brain, known as the medial orbital frontal cortex, is activated. So as a result of this, we find that when people want to nourish their emotional brain, they're seeking for those things that are beautiful. In contrast to the minimalist experience of architecture without ornament, when we look at these images of buildings, they possess different patterns. They possess ornament. Zeki's team concludes that the universality of architectural beauty probably lies in its satisfying inherited brain concepts of proportion, harmony, and geometric relationships that are more formally expressed in mathematical terms. One of these patterns is called the fractal, and we've heard a little bit about this, and we were having a conversation over lunch about fractals. But one of the best textbooks that we have on beauty is nature herself. Michael Snyder, in his book, A Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe. Sounds esoteric, but it's actually a really good book. He suggests that nature itself rests on an internal foundation of archetypal principles, symbolized by numbers, shapes, and their arithmetic and geometric relationships. We find these in the smallest subatomic particles to the largest galactic structures. So, what are fractal patterns? How do they affect us? Well, a fractal pattern is a pattern that repeats itself on different scales. Trees are a great example. Dr. Bruce talked about this earlier. And although these patterns are observed at different magnifications, they don't necessarily repeat exactly the same, but analysis shows that they have the same statistical qualities. Now, when it comes to fractals, there's two different types. There's exact, which are more mathematical based, and then there's statistical fractals, which are more found in nature themselves. So when we're looking at how do you measure a fractal, there's a dimension to them, right? Something that is non-fractal is either 1, or a completely solid square would be 2. Those are non-fractals. Anything in between there would have a fractal dimension. Now, Dr. Richard Taylor and his colleagues have done a number of studies, and one of the things that they looked at with statistical fractals and exact fractals is that those that are found in nature, humans generally, they prefer a lower fractal dimension. When it comes to mathematical-based fractals that we define in art and architecture, people prefer a higher threshold. And so we ran this through eye tracking emulation software to see where would your eyes look in that first 3 to 5 seconds. And lo and behold, it's right there in the middle of what we anticipate. Now, I believe someone, I can't remember who spoke on this last year, but with the fractal dimension, we find that fractals in nature, they typically follow this pattern of the 1.3 to 1.5. Human preferences on the conscious level that we just saw were 1.3 to 1.5, but some even have a higher threshold. And then on the unconscious level, which is before our age, gender comes into play, it's the 1.3 to 1.7. And so you may be asking, well, that's nice. What does all these numbers mean? Well, when it comes to non-modernist architecture or traditional classical architecture, they have a similar threshold. There's been a number of studies that have shown that viewing fractals in and of themselves, whether it's in artwork or others, can actually affect the level of stress that we experience as human beings. So the 1986 NASA study showed that skin conductance measurements were used to measure people's physiological responses to different images. Those that were abstract, like the image on the top, actually increased stress, where those that were of nature actually decreased stress. And so if we looked at those images and ran them through the eye tracking simulation software, we can see how much attention is actually going to some of those images. So I'd like to move on to then what is ornament. Stemming from the Latin verb ornare, ornament is really to confer grace or honor on something. It's to dress something up. It's to equip it, to decorate it, to furnish, to adorn, to garnish, to trim, to embellish. And ultimately, ornament is to beautify something. If we take ornament from its Greek roots, from cosmos, ornament then relates to ordering something, taking chaotic matter and creating a cosmos from it, creating order from that. Now, a couple of definitions of ornament are as follows. Dr. McNamara, in his book on Catholic Church architecture, suggests that ornament is this enrichment of a building that reveals its use, its purpose. Decoration, on the other hand, is this enrichment of architecture that adds beauty by making the structural systems more legible. It's a poetic expression of structure. Now, in Utah, this is our Utah State Capitol, and if you're looking at these images, we start to zoom in on them, and as the closer and closer you get, more detailed patterns are revealed. So Stephen Sims, in his book, The Architecture of the Classical Interior, suggests that ornament could be defined as the architecture of the near view. Now, Alberti describes ornament in a number of ways. One of the ways that he describes is that actually the column itself is the principal ornament. He suggests that you can combine this to adorn a portico, a wall, a form of opening. Ultimately, all of these possibilities confers grace and dignity on a project. So ornament is not just the sculptural decorative components. It can also be the classical orders themselves. So why ornament? For Alberti, he suggests that it's allowed that the pleasure and delight which we feel on the view of any building, it arises from nothing else but from beauty and ornament. He goes on to even suggest that beauty will have such an effect on an enraged enemy that it will disarm his anger and prevent him from offering it any injury. So if our buildings are beautiful enough, we will not have a desire to destroy them. So when it comes to when we can use ornament, and we're thinking about the various classifications and its functions, we can either do one of three things. We're trying to convey something that is symbolic or allegorical. We might be trying to celebrate a mythical historical person, event, or a place. At the same time, we might be using ornament as a mnemonic or memory device, trying to convey learning and understanding. It could also be used to invite onlookers and teach them something through lettering, patterns, and other memory devices. Lastly, it's the aesthetic component. It could just be decor. And this leads me to a quote by Carsten Harries, where he describes that ornament has a narrative function to it. He says, "From now on, I shall call decoration that articulates a communal ethos ornament, and decoration that we experience primarily as an aesthetic addition to building decoration. So understood, decoration is the aesthetic analog to ornament." Now, having just returned from a trip with some students to Washington, D.C., in this photo at the Library of Congress, there's various narrative messages and meanings that are being conveyed through the architectural details, through stained glass, painting, sculpture, the like. But with all of this, we have to think, can we create ornament, a new language, just out of the blue? Stephen Sams argues that it's virtually impossible to invent a new system of ornament, just as it is virtually impossible to invent a new language. Ornament, he goes on, works like grammar. Its forms drawing life from the repetition and subtle variation, while remaining grounded in memories and recognizable models. So if we think about when to use ornament, we also need to think about how and what types of ornament can be used. There's various types of ornament, from human, animal, to man-made objects, to geometric, to using letters themselves. And so here's a couple of examples where we could use the human figure in architectural ornament on our buildings. This is from the U.S. Capitol. We might also think about geometries. How can we use those geometries to organize floor patterns, ceiling patterns? This is from the Library of Congress. Here's some examples from projects I worked on in the Baton Rouge, Louisiana temple. We used various ornamental motifs, and as we were doing this, our client came back and said, well, you know, those carved stone panels, are those really worth it? So we had the stone subcontractor price them out to see how much is this actually costing the client. How much do you think it was? It was only 1% to 2% of the stone budget, and that included construction, installation costs. So what we learned from this is that the cost of ornament, the cost to beautify your structures, is minimal. Now, more often than not, we have a hybrid combination of a number of different types of ornament. We can have human figures, vegetal motifs, geometries, animal life. So where do we place ornament? A lot of times, ornament is placed directly on the classical moldings themselves, which is the alphabet, the smallest atomic part of architecture. Oftentimes we have on the ovalo molding here, we can see the egg and dart motif. It lends itself well to that. Or to the cyma reversa, we have the leaf and dart motif. Now, with all of this, the most important aspect is education. How many of you are students here in the audience today? Wonderful. So one of the things that we teach our students is to learn from sketching and observation to create measured drawings. And according to Kent Bloomer, Yale professor, he says, the language of ornament, like the language of speech and music, must be nourished by active procedure of renewal and education. There's simply not enough time within each successive generation of designers and artisans to reinvent the complex grammar and visual eloquence that are manifest in the most outstanding projects from the past. So we now get to the point of the presentation where we ask the question then, how does ornament affect our brains? Well, we know that half of all of the sensory information that we're processing going to the brain is visual in nature. So when we're looking at these images, for instance, I'm reminded of the quote by the 18th century Edmund Burke, who suggested that beauty is for a greater part some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses, close quote. So looking at that definition more clearly by Edmund Burke, we learn that 2/3 of it is based on the brain. Now, if we were to look at the classical orders themselves, but let's say we start to strip away some of those elements from the column capitals to the triglyphs on the Doric order to a number of things, and we put this through eye tracking to see where is our attention landing. What do you notice? Most of our attention is landing, especially up here on the top, those Doric orders where the triglyphs are actually present. Whereas those that have been stripped down or a lot of the classical elements have been removed, we still are looking at those, but ultimately the attention is not as high. Now, on the flip side, if we were to remove all ornament and to put you in a bare, plain room, what's going to happen? Well, there's been a number of studies that have shown that this type of sensory deprivation or a lack of ornament, it actually increases cognitive impairment, anxiety, and depression. In fact, it's been used by a number of psychologists who have done studies on this, and they found that people that were put into a room like this, after 48 hours, they were hallucinating. They'd gone crazy. Now, other rooms, white rooms, and putting individuals in them have also been deemed a form of torture. So that makes you ask the question then, is less really more, or is less a bore? So we're going to look at a couple instances of what are the implications of the fractals that we were talking about earlier, and especially as it relates to architecture. Now, this is a drawing by Leon Creer where he tries to illustrate this point pretty clearly. From a distance, a modern and a traditional building will look the same. Same with a person off in the distance. But as we get closer and closer to those, there's not as much detail. And so when our eye is bored, our brain is bored. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. This is the Port of Antwerp in Belgium, where you have a modernist addition to a historic building. So if we put this through eye tracking, similar to that distance from afar, we can see that visual attention lands on the entire thing, both the traditional building and the modern addition above it. As we get closer, that level of fractal scaling, closer to the building, the details start to somewhat fade away a little bit. But ultimately, as we get even closer, the modernist building tends to lose our visual attention. And this is all on the unconscious level, okay? Now, we might also think about what are the implications for design styles of architecture. Now, designs that possess fractal patterns, these proportions and geometries that are based in nature, they will resonate with us more and hold our attention better than those that do not. So here you have a couple of church examples. A couple here in the United States as well as in France. Another modern one in Spain, the Parish Church of Santa Monica, and the Oakland Cathedral of Christ the Light. And what do you notice between the traditional buildings versus the modern ones? The visual attention is much more fragmented, and the eye doesn't know necessarily where to go. So this brings me to another study that we looked at, and Justin's presentation earlier has already explained how in their findings they conducted this survey to see what people preferred, traditional or modern federal buildings. And what we were looking at specifically is taking those same images, and we're asking people, which of these do you prefer? So as people are looking at the two images, we found that 72% like the traditional, 28% like the modern. And so our question then was why? Why is this the case, right? So we put these through our eye tracking emulation software, and there's a number of reports that popped out. But ultimately, what we found with all of this is that most of the traditional buildings gathered more visual attention than the modern ones. Now, it wasn't completely the case. So here was the Harris poll that was mentioned. All of the traditional buildings won. Now, with our study, there were two modern buildings that actually won over the traditional ones. So we wondered, why is that the case? So we looked at those two specific pairs of buildings. And we started noticing that a couple of these buildings had a lot of vegetation, like a big tree in front of it. All of these had other trees. And so we said, okay, well, let's take those trees, those vegetation, the biophilic elements out of the equation, and let's put it back through the simulation. So we did a little Photoshop magic. We took out all of the vegetation. We also took out all of the cars, people, things that would kind of distract, that were obscuring the buildings. And what we found was that after doing this, the traditional buildings actually did win. So going back to our original, the Harris poll, and then after we removed those biophilic elements, we had alignment with that. And just recently, this past week, this study has been published. So if you'd like to access this, feel free to take a snapshot of that. But we ran a series of statistical tests to see, okay, is this just by chance? And so after running through those things, what we found was that the traditional buildings were able to retain people's attention. It didn't go down when people took it on the conscious level. So the scans were the unconscious level. before our age, gender, etc. comes into play. And then once our consciousness comes into play, as was demonstrated by the demographics that Justin showed, we had complete resonance with that. Now, with the modern buildings, what we found was that the modern buildings did not always have the ability to gather our attention, but sometimes they did. And those that did not, we found that later visual attention actually went down. So there's other implications of this idea about minimalist and complex architecture and design and ornament. And how does it apply to like historic preservation or historic buildings? So here's the Jewish Museum in Berlin, Germany. We see the original older Baroque palace, the Kollegienhaus. And it has a very comprehensive, ordered, harmonious design. Daniel Libskin's addition on the side of it, and you actually enter the museum through the more traditional building to get to this one. Our visual attention, even despite some of the jarring architectural moves, right, it doesn't hold our visual attention as well as the older Baroque palace. If we look at another addition to a historic building by Daniel Libskin, we find a similar thing with the Military History Museum in Dresden. We see overall there's visual attention on the entire thing, but when we look at the hot spots, where does our attention lie? It lies on the two side wings, the main central, and maybe a little bit on the triangulated addition to that. Now, what about the Louvre in Paris and the glass pyramid? We ran this through, and we found that most of the visual attention goes whoop, right over I.M. Pei's glass pyramid. Isn't that interesting? And we see that also with the hotspots, that really the visual attention, the glass pyramid does not hold our attention. Now, those that are studying traditional or classical design, this also have implications for you. Oftentimes you're starting with the classical orders, and then you start to strip away elements. And so one of my students looked at this particular study. This was his design proposal for a new museum. And he decided, okay, well, let's strip away the elements. So let's do kind of this approach where we strip off the classical orders. We still maintain somewhat of an essence of a cornice. And then we completely strip everything away and kind of have a modern glass office building. The other end, he added a lot of ornament to this to see, what would happen. And so he ran this through the eye tracking emulation software to see where the visual attention was actually landing. And progressively, as you would imagine with the fractal qualities, the visual attention was very low on the modern one, slightly increased. His proposal had 61, add some ornament, it was quite rather the same, but a little bit of an increase. So we decided, let's look at a number of other examples. Is this just a one-off situation? So we looked at the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. They have the Classical Primer book where they're showing this idea of progressive omission, where you start with the classical orders and you slowly strip away elements where you completely eliminate the columns, capital and base, eliminate the columns themselves, maintain just a cornice, and then we get to the far, which is more a vernacular building. And ran those through the eye tracking, and we found a similar thing. The most visual attention was on the highly decorated, the 61%, and it slowly went down from there. We looked at Robert Adams' illustration of progressive omission, and we found a similar thing. The high classical had the most visual attention. You start to strip away the elements, and the visual attention went down. That's great. But what about the experience of the inside of a building? So we also looked at interior design. What happens if we were to go into a room and we're to use the classical orders? We have some ornament on the frieze panels and above the door, and then we start to slowly strip that away. Well, we found the same thing. The most decorative, and we'll recall Alberti's description of an ornament, it's also the column itself. So we start stripping those away and our visual attention goes down. We did that with Robert Adams' drawings and we found a similar thing. We also did a 3D mock-up of what would happen if you're in a blank room. We start to add a couple of columns there. We add some chair rail. We add some other details and niches and things like that. And we found the similar thing. And so with all of that, we said then, okay, we've looked at a number of cases. Is this really true? Is there a relationship between architectural complexity or the ornamentation, the level of ornamentation, and the visual attention that is actually landing on a project? And we found a statistically significant relationship between those two. So as we come full circle then, we start to ask ourselves, is ornament really a crime, Adolf Loos? No. It's probably could be considered criminal to design a building without ornament because it's detrimental for our human health. Less is not more, Mies. I'm sorry. We have to side with Venturi, and less is a bore. And so ultimately, by diving into these related concepts, I'm hoping that each of you will see the significant role that architectural ornament does play on our visual attention, but ultimately on our human health and well-being. Now, Adolf Loos, after the modernists really embraced this thought that ornament is criminal, he went back and, a couple decades later and basically said, actually, what everyone thought I said, they kind of took it and ran with it the wrong way. In his essay titled Ornament in Education, he said, I did not mean what some purists have called ad absurdum, namely that ornament should be systematically and consistently eliminated. Our education is based on classical culture. An architect is a bricklayer who has learned Latin. The starting point for drawing instruction should be classical ornamentation. I'll repeat that again to the modernists. Adolf Loos suggested that the starting point for drawing instruction should be classical ornamentation. Classical education has created, despite the differences of languages and frontiers, a common Western culture. To abandon it would be to destroy this last common ground. And he concludes, it is for that reason we should cultivate not only classical ornament, but also the orders of columns and moldings. So Adolf Loos, unfortunately, your first essay really started a movement. But he redeemed himself, I would say, by coming out a couple decades later and trying to clarify what he really meant about ornament. Ultimately, I'd like to thank you all for listening to this talk, and I hope you're able to find something important about this connection between beauty and the brain and the important role that ornamentation does play on our buildings and our human health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Daniel.